What's up, everybody? Travis here, and I'm back again with a book review. This time we're going to be reviewing this very nice Jiu-Jitsu book. I love Jiu-Jitsu, so I'm very excited for this one. Opening Closed Guard, The Origins of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, and it is by Robert Drysdale. Robert Drysdale is a 5th degree black belt. He is both American and Brazilian, which makes him a really good author for this type of a book. He grew up in Brazil. He's also been living in the United States in Las Vegas. He is the only American to have won both the IBJJF and the ADCC World Championships in Jiu-Jitsu. He was also a UFC fighter for a brief while, has an MMA career, and now he teaches and coaches Jiu-Jitsu, and he's also the owner of Zenith Jiu-Jitsu, which is a school out of Las Vegas, Nevada. So this book was so interesting. There's so many different pictures and faces here on the cover. First, you start off with Jigoro Kano, that is the founder of Judo, and he founded Judo in the mid-1800s. Then right here you have Count Maeda, or Mitsuyo Maeda. He was also called Count Koma in Brazil. Then you have Gio Omori, who was a adopter of Judo, and he also taught Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. And then you really go down the list. That is Jacinto Ferro, that's Carlos Gracie, that is Donato Pires dos Reis, who was another student of Count Maeda. Then you have Elio Gracie, Oswaldo Fada, then you have George Gracie, Luis Franca, Armando Wright, and then some of the other influential figures of both Judo and Jiu-Jitsu. There's a common story that is told in Jiu-Jitsu, and it is that Carlos and Elio Gracie founded Jiu-Jitsu, and they brought it to the United States, and then Royce Gracie wins the first few UFCs, and then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu takes off as a martial art. And that is usually how the history of Jiu-Jitsu is conveyed to American Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, myself included. I train under the Gracie CTCs. CTC stands for Certified Training Center. It is under the Gracie University umbrella, which is a school in Torrance. That is where Rorion Gracie, Elio Gracie, and now it's led by Rener and Hidon Gracie. They trained at that academy. And there's a lot of talk about the Gracies in this book. And one of the most interesting pieces of information that I got from this book is that, yes, the Gracies popularized Jiu-Jitsu. They were amazing at marketing Jiu-Jitsu, and since it was in Brazil, they branded it as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But originally, the martial art, it was an offshoot or an offspring of Judo. And in Japan, in the 1800s, Jigoro Kano founded Judo, which was a modified version of Jiu-Jitsu. There was a Japanese historian that talked about how Jiu-Jitsu was a martial art it was a martial art to kill people, and Judo was a martial art to educate people. And in Japan, there was a trend away from the killing, the Jiu-Jitsu, the brutality of that martial art, because, as they put it, the age of the samurai was no more. And so they didn't really have a reason to practice that martial art. They instead focused on Judo, which focused more on education and self-defense. Then they took that Judo and a little bit of groundwork, and they brought it to Brazil. And Count Maeda, Mitsuyo Maeda, he is widely renowned as the father of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he traveled the world teaching Jiu-Jitsu and Judo. But there were also other Japanese instructors teaching Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil in the early 1900s. And so Mitsuyo Maeda wasn't the only person who was teaching people this martial art. And then you had Carlos Gracie, who picks it up from Maeda, and he had his instructor, Jacinto Ferro. And Jacinto Ferro is someone that was a student of Maeda, but he really isn't talked about enough in common BJJ circles and in popular history. And that was the really good part about this book, is that Robert Drysdale, he tells the story not only about Count Maeda or Carlos Gracie or Elio Gracie, he tells the story of these other individuals who came along and influenced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This individual right here, his name is George Gracie, and he was the he was the other brother, and then there are other family members, there are other lineages other than the Gracies that started with Maeda, and they really don't get talked about enough. So I could talk for hours about this book. It was a really good book. You could tell that Robert Drysdale, he put a lot of effort into it. He really cared from the depths of his soul about telling the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in as accurate a way as possible. Coming from the CTCs, coming from Henner and Hidon School, I have so much respect for both of those individuals. I know that they did online blue belts early on in the Gracie Academy, but they switched that after it got negative feedback. I do want to say that it did seem at times that Robert was critical of Henner and Hidon. He was also a little critical of Elio. But what trumps all of that was that he really wanted to find the truth, and he interviewed so many people from Brazil. He interviewed not only Royce Gracie, not only Carlson Gracie, but he interviewed Oswaldo Fada, which was another lineage aside from Elio and Carlos Gracie. He interviewed Armando Wright, who was another Brazilian. He was another Brazilian grandmaster who was not really directly associated with the Gracies. And there was just so much history within this book, and it really talks about it. It really made me understand the importance of having a good reputation and making sure that you understand that when you're on this earth, your legacy is going to be told after you're gone by the people who knew you best. And you should be well aware of your reputation. You should understand the legacy that you're leaving behind, because Robert Drysdale couldn't talk to the original Gracies. He couldn't talk to the original founders of Jiu-Jitsu, but he could talk to all of the people that were that resulted from their lineage. All of the students of these grandmasters carried on the legacy of the people who started Jiu-Jitsu. And so it did a really good job, this book, of just fleshing out the world, explaining the lore behind Jiu-Jitsu, and just letting all of us BJJ practitioners know that, yes, Elio Gracie, Carlos Gracie, all the Gracies, they played a huge part in BJJ, but oftentimes the Gracies are synonymous with BJJ, and we should understand that there were many other people that were influential, that really contributed to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What was also really cool about this book was that it went into the history of not only Jiu-Jitsu, but Judo in Japan with Jigoro Kano, who founded Judo, where he got Judo from. And so there's so much history behind this book. It's such a rich narrative of how Jiu-Jitsu was crafted. In terms of a review score, I give this an 8.5 out of 10. Really, really good book, rich in detail, rich in history. There were so many cool life lessons that you could pick up from all of these grandmasters that Professor Robert Drysdale interviewed. And he really put his heart and soul into this book, and that's why it's definitely worth the read. If you're a fan of Jiu-Jitsu, if you're a fan of understanding the history of these martial arts, I highly recommend this book. It was well worth the read. Opening Closed Guard. I love the title, by the way. Opening Closed Guard, the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. You also have a ton of different faces on the back. Really extensive in terms of how many figures within martial arts, Judo and Jiu-Jitsu, were interviewed. And also, one last thing, there's another ground martial art in Japan, and it's called Fusen Ryu. And that is another martial art, in addition to Jiu-Jitsu and Judo, which practice the ground fighting, or I think it's called Newaza. Tachiwaza is standing in Judo, and Newaza is the ground fighting in Jiu-Jitsu, and in Judo a little bit as well. And then the other not-so-known martial art, Fusen Ryu. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Highly recommend the book. Pick it up. Like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate all the engagement. You can find me on Instagram, Travis D'Souza Quotes, and then you can find me on Twitter, Travis D'Souza. Thanks, everybody. I'll catch you next time on the next book review. Take care.